Rosalind Merrivale left the Duke of Graymere waiting before the altar with 167 guests watching. She walked out before the vows, carrying no jewels, no money worth naming, and no certainty that any respectable door in England would open to her again. By nightfall, the Duke had ordered every road watched. He would spend a year learning why the woman he had treated as a bargain had chosen ruin over becoming his wife. This is a story of a vow refused, a lie carried north, and a proud man who learned that finding a woman was not the same as earning her return. Cold rain had darkened the old stones of St. Bartholomew's until the church smelled of wet wool, beeswax, and the rosemary crushed beneath too many polished shoes. Inside the vestry, Rosalind stood while her aunt fastened the final pearl button at her wrist. The Brussels lace veil dragged over the tiled floor like a pale breath. Beyond the oak door, the organist played the first trembling measure of the processional and stopped when one pipe gave a sickly wheeze. "No one will hear that once the congregation begins whispering," Aunt Honoria said. They had already begun. Rosalind could distinguish individual voices through the door. Lady Casterly wondered aloud whether a merchant's granddaughter ought to wear family lace. Someone replied that £80,000 could make even cotton look hereditary. A man laughed. The sound struck harder because Rosalind knew the voice belonged to Lord Ambrose Vane, the Duke's cousin and heir presumptive. She lowered her eyes to the prayer book in her hands. The book had been waiting on the vestry table when she arrived, bound in cream calfskin with her new initials stamped in gold, R.G. It was a gift from the Duke, or so the card had said. Something black showed between the pages of the marriage service. Rosalind thought it was a ribbon. When she opened the book, a folded sheet slid against her glove. The paper bore the Graymere crest in black wax. She recognized the firm, slanting hand. She had received 6 letters from His Grace during their 4-month betrothal, each correct, brief, and as warm as a locked door. Ambrose: "The woman may keep her charities until the ceremony. Once her signature and fortune are mine, Bracken House will contain her. A physician can be found to call her nerves unsound. She will trouble neither you nor me again." Cassian the organ began once more. Aunt Honoria was speaking, but the words passed without meaning. Rosalind read the 3 lines again. Bracken House stood on the farthest edge of the Graymere estate. A damp dower house shuddered since the old Duchess had died there. During the settlement negotiations, Rosalind had insisted that the income from her mother's mills continue to support the school, the infirmary, and 23 widows whose husbands had died in a boiler accident. The Duke had called the provision unusual. Her father had called it sentimental nonsense. Lord Ambrose had smiled and said a wife soon learned which concerns belonged to her husband. The marriage settlement protected £2,000 a year for Rosalind's separate use through trustees. Everything else would pass beneath her husband's control. English law would make them one person, and that person would be the Duke. The hard line of black wax trembled between her fingers. "Your face has gone gray," Aunt Honoria said. "Do not faint, not today." Rosalind folded the letter once. "Ask His Grace to come here. The processional has begun. Then he will have to walk 12 steps farther than he expected." Her aunt stared at her. Rosalind had spent 25 years being described as obliging. She had endured a father who presented her good sense as obedience. A London season in which titled women inspected her as if she were a bolt of cloth, and a betrothal negotiated across a table while Lord Ambrose discussed her fortune in the third person. No one had ever been required to discover what remained when her patience ended. The vestry door opened before Aunt Honoria could answer. Cassian Ashcombe, 9th Duke of Graymere, filled the doorway in black and silver. At 34, he had the stillness of a man accustomed to rooms rearranging themselves around him. Rain shone on one shoulder of his coat. His dark hair had been combed back. though one strand had escaped near his temple. He looked not tender, not eager, but controlled. Behind him stood Lord Ambrose, fair-haired and smiling. "Miss Merrivale," Cassian said, "the Archbishop's license will not improve with age." Rosalind held the folded paper inside her prayer book. "I require one honest answer before I stand beside you." His gaze moved to her aunt, then to Ambrose. "Leave us." Ambrose's smile narrowed. He closed the door as he withdrew. Rosalind looked at the man she had agreed to marry. In 4 months, Cassian had never lied to her. He had never offered enough of himself to make lying necessary. That restraint had once seemed safer than false affection. Now it looked like the smooth face of a locked cell. After the ceremony, she said, "Will I remain free to direct the money reserved for the Mill widows? The settlement is signed. That was not my question." His jaw tightened. 5 minutes earlier, Ambrose had informed him that Mr. Merrivale demanded another £20,000 be settled upon Rosalind's father before the bride would enter the church. Cassian had spent the morning answering threats. Creditors and an estate steward who reported that the South Farms could not survive another failed harvest. He heard another negotiation in Rosalind's voice and mistook fear for strategy. "Your trustees will obey the settlement," he said. "You will obey me." The organ stopped. Rosalind's fingers became very still. "Is obedience all you require from your wife?" "Today, yes." "We can discuss the rest when the church is empty." That was the moment. She did not show him the letter. A man who could speak of obedience while she stood dressed to surrender her name had already given the answer that mattered. Rosalind removed her veil. One pin caught in her hair and pulled hard enough to bring tears to her eyes, but she freed it without a sound. She laid the lace across the prayer desk. Then she placed the book on top of it, the black sealed letter left open at the marriage service. "The church is not yet empty, Your Grace," she said, "but I am." She opened the door. Lord Ambrose stood close enough to have heard. For one unguarded second, triumph brightened his face. Rosalind saw it. She walked past him before fear could root her to the floor. The nave seemed longer than it had during rehearsal. 167 faces turned. The candles bent in a draught from the open west door. Her father rose from the front pew, his cheeks dark with fury. A woman gasped when Rosalind passed the altar without stopping. Rosalind. Her father's warning carried through the church. She continued. Rain struck her bare hair as she stepped outside. It soaked the shoulders of her ivory gown within seconds and turned the churchyard gravel black beneath her satin slippers. No carriage waited for a bride who had refused to become one. At the lich gate, an old green gig rolled out from behind a yew hedge. Mrs. Ada Bristow, Rosalind's former governess, held the reins. Rosalind had sent her a note at dawn asking her to wait nearby, not because she planned to flee, but because some instinct had begged for one person at the wedding who belonged to neither family. Mrs. Bristow took in the uncovered hair, the missing veil, and the church doors opening behind her. "Get in," she said. Rosalind climbed beside her. The gig lurched onto the road just as Cassian appeared at the church steps. He called her name once. She looked back. Rain silvered the distance between them. He was holding the black-sealed letter. Then the road curved, and the church disappeared. But the inevitable pursuit did not begin as Rosalind expected. It began with the Duke reading a sentence he had never written. Cassian stood in the vestry while rain tapped against the painted glass. The abandoned veil lay where Rosalind had placed it. Beneath the forged letter, she had written 6 words in pencil. "I will not disappear inside your name." He read the other words again. "Bracken House, a physician, her fortune." "An unfortunate display," Ambrose said from the doorway. "Her father swears she has always been unstable. We should tell the guests she suffered a seizure." Cassian lifted the paper toward the light. His crest had been pressed into black wax with what appeared to be his signet. Yet the lower point of the griffon's wing was whole. The true signet had been chipped when Cassian struck it against a stone mantel 3 years earlier. Anyone who had copied an older impression would reproduce an undamaged wing. He raised his eyes. "How did you know the letter mentioned a physician?" Ambrose's face changed by less than a breath. "You told me." "No." The single word emptied the doorway of warmth. Ambrose recovered first. Then she invented it. A bride who flees an altar must provide herself with a villain. Cassian crossed the room. "Find Merrivale. Ask which carriage his daughter took. You cannot mean to chase her. The entire county saw what she did to you." Cassian looked at the open church door, at the rain on the stones, and at one muddy print left by a satin slipper. "That," he said, "is why I must know what was done to her." By the time Mr. Merrivale admitted that Mrs. Bristow owned a green gig, Rosalind had exchanged it for 2 seats on the York mail coach at the Saracen's Head. Mrs. Bristow wrapped her in a brown wool cloak and cut the pearl buttons from the wet wedding gown while they waited in a rented room above the stable. "The dress will be recognized," she said. "The cloak may not." Rosalind watched 12 pearls fall into the governess's palm. "My father will say I have ruined him. Your father survived 3 bankrupt partners and a fire at his warehouse. He will survive a daughter with a will. Society will not. Society survives everything except being ignored." The mail coach left in the afternoon with 4 inside passengers, several outside, and the Royal Mail Guard seated behind with a blunderbuss across his knees. The horses were changed at posting inns with a speed Rosalind had never noticed from a private carriage. Ostlers ran through rain and steam. Leather traces slapped against wet flanks. The guard sounded his horn before each yard had fully released them. At the first stop, a postboy recognized Mrs. Bristow's description from a messenger who had ridden ahead. Rosalind saw him studying her brown cloak while a fresh team was harnessed. She stepped down, crossed the smoky taproom, and left by the kitchen door. Mrs. Bristow followed with their 1 valise. They paid a carrier of wool 3 shillings to take them east instead of north. Sitting beneath a tarpaulin that smelled of lanolin and damp earth, that choice erased them from the Duke's road. For the first week, Cassian searched as a duke. He sent grooms to turnpike gates, letters to inns, and a confidential description to 2 men attached to the Bow Street office. He expected doors to open because they always had. They opened. Rosalind was never behind them. At the end of the first week, he found Mrs. Bristow's gig abandoned in a livery yard. At the end of the second, he found the room where the pearls had been cut from the gown. The landlady had kept one beneath a saucer. "The younger lady cried?" Cassian asked. "No, Your Grace. She paid for the mending of my kitchen girl's boots. A woman running from theft doesn't notice another person's feet." By the 3rd week, the newspapers had invented an Italian singer, a gaming debt, and a secret child. Mr. Merrivale published a notice declaring that he would not answer for debts contracted by his daughter. Cassian sent no public reply. A denial would feed the scandal and expose every road on which Rosalind might be hiding. Instead, he returned to St. Bartholomew's and examined the prayer book. The card claiming it was his gift had been written by Ambrose's secretary. The bookseller remembered a fair-haired gentleman ordering the initials. The black wax contained lamp soot, a trick used to darken ordinary sealing wax. At Bow Street, an officer named Jonas Cobb placed the forged impression beside an old Graymere invitation. "Copied clean from the old mark," Cobb said. "Whoever made the mold knew where to look." Cassian thought of Ambrose laughing in the church, close enough to hear Rosalind's questions through the vestry door. Find him. But Lord Ambrose had vanished as neatly as the bride. Rosalind learned of none of this. By the time London tired of her disgrace, she and Mrs. Bristow had reached the North Sea beneath names that had never appeared on a wedding license. Rosalind became Mrs. Rose Bell, a widow whose husband had died abroad. Mrs. Bristow became her aunt. They arrived at St. Aldwyn's in a rain so cold that it seemed to contain ground glass. The year 1816 had produced a spring without warmth. Frost clung to the shaded ditches in May, lambs died in muddy fields, and the wheat stood thin beneath a colorless sky. St. Aldwyn's was a fishing village pressed between black cliffs and a restless gray sea. The mail coach did not go there. The final 7 miles were traveled in a fish cart beside baskets of cod, with gulls wheeling overhead and salt drying white upon Rosalind's cloak. The Blue Heron Inn had 6 rooms, 3 leaking chimneys, and a widowed owner named Elspeth Marr, who looked at Rosalind's soft hands before naming a price twice as high as it ought to have been. Rosalind paid for 1 week. On the second morning, she found Mrs. Marr in the kitchen arguing with a harbor collector over a row of copper tally tokens. Each fisherman received a token when he paid the landing due. The collector claimed 17 boats had failed to pay. Mrs. Marr insisted the men had paid in fish because coin had grown scarce. Then they owe twice, the collector said. Lord Vane's order. Rosalind stopped beside the flour bin. "Which Lord Vane?" she asked. The collector glanced at her. "Lord Ambrose Vane. His lordship administers the Graymere Northern Holdings." The room seemed to tilt beneath Rosalind's feet. She had traveled 200 miles to escape the Duke and landed on property carrying his name. Mrs. Bristow touched her elbow. They could leave before noon. Rosalind had 17 guineas remaining, her mother's sapphire brooch, and no destination less uncertain than the one before her. The collector gathered the tokens. One fell near Rosalind's shoe. She picked it up. The Graymere Griffin, stamped into the copper, had an unbroken wing. The same false crest marked the letter that had destroyed her wedding. Rosalind closed her hand around the token. "We are staying," she said. The decision was not courage. It was anger given a chair, a table, and work to do. Rosalind began with the harbor dues. She asked Mrs. Marr to bring every receipt she possessed, then spent 3 nights sorting scraps of paper beside a tallow candle that smoked whenever the wick mushroomed. Candles of good beeswax belonged to drawing rooms. The kitchen burned tallow, and the sour animal smell clung to Rosalind's hair. The figures revealed a simple theft. The fishermen paid one due at the harbor and another at the warehouse. Lord Ambrose's collector recorded neither in the quarterly return sent south. When storms ruined a boat, the debt continued against the widow. A man could drown in January and still be charged for landing fish in March. "Everyone knows it is wrong," Mrs. Marr said. "Knowing is not the same as stopping it." "No," Rosalind replied. "Stopping it requires proof." She persuaded 11 fishing families to place their tokens in labeled flour sacks. She copied the date, boat, catch, and demanded charge onto separate sheets. Then asked each man or widow to make a mark before 2 witnesses. She did not use the polished language of the settlement rooms. She sat in kitchens, drank bitter chicory, and listened until suspicion loosened. A girl named Nessa Cole brought a token belonging to her father, lost at sea 5 months earlier. "Collector says ma'am must pay before he'll let my brothers use the berth," the child said. Rosalind turned the copper disc over. A second stamp had been punched into the back. A tiny crown above the letter A. Ambrose. She gave Nessa the last of the honey from breakfast and wrote down her father's name. Within a month, St. Aldwyn's had stopped calling her the Pale Widow. They called her Mrs. Bell from the Heron, the woman who could make a thief regret arithmetic. Her money dwindled. Respect did not pay rent, and proof did not buy coal. Rosalind sold the sapphire brooch to a jeweler in Whitby and used half the price to lease an abandoned sail loft beside the harbor. The roof leaked, the windows rattled. 20 women scrubbed the floor with sand, set up trestle tables, and began mending nets and stitching canvas for ships that had previously sent such work inland. Rosalind paid by the finished yard, not by the day, so a mother could carry work home when a child was ill. She learned the width of sackcloth, the price of flax, and the difference between honest shrinkage and a warehouseman's theft. Mrs. Bristow taught letters to 6 girls in the back room. The first profitable order arrived in a red-sealed envelope from a coastal brig. The second was cancelled after Lord Ambrose's agent visited the captain. The third never reached them. One morning, Rosalind found the loft door marked with a black cross in tar. Beneath it lay a copper token split cleanly in two. Ambrose had learned that someone was counting. In Hertfordshire, June rain flattened the hay and turned the Graymere lanes into brown rivers. Cassian stood in the south granary, while his steward explained that 12 tenant families would be removed before Michaelmas if their arrears were not paid. 6 months earlier, Cassian would have examined the sum and approved whatever preserved the estate. Now he remembered Rosalind at the settlement table, her gloved finger resting beside a provision for widows. "How much grain remains in the hunting stable?" he asked. The steward blinked. "That barley is reserved for your Grace's horses. Sell 8 hunters. Distribute the barley. Suspend the rents until harvest." "Your father never suspended a rent. My father is dead. His debts are not. I see no reason to preserve his mistakes with his horses. The sale offended half the county." Cassian attended none of the dinners at which it was discussed. Each week he traveled a different road with Jonas Cobb, showing innkeepers a small portrait of Rosalind and asking questions himself. He learned the geography of absence. A chambermaid remembered a lady who folded her own wet gown. A stable boy remembered a widow who knew the cost of oats. At an inn near Malton, a surgeon recalled a brown-cloaked woman who paid him to treat a coachman's feverish child, then left before he could learn her name. "She asked whether the east road reached the sea," the surgeon said. It was the first true direction in 4 months. Cassian rode east. He searched Scarborough, Filey, Bridlington, and every village whose name appeared on a coastal chart. At each harbor he found too many widows in brown cloaks, and none with Rosalind's level gray gaze. On the last day of July, a messenger from Graymere brought a packet of estate returns. The northern holdings had produced no income for 2 quarters. Lord Ambrose's signature appeared beneath an explanation of storm losses and failed fisheries. Cassian stared at the page. "Storms everywhere," Cobb said, reading over his shoulder. "Convenient ones." The return was stamped with the old unbroken griffin. Cassian turned his horse toward St. Aldwyn's. He arrived 3 days too late. Rosalind had gone inland to negotiate a canvas order with a shipowner. Mrs. Marr saw a black traveling carriage enter the village and assumed Ambrose had come to collect his dues. She sent Rosalind a warning by a shepherd boy, and told Cassian that Mrs. Bell had left for Scotland. Cassian stood in the Blue Heron's kitchen with rain dripping from his coat. On the table lay piles of copied receipts, each written in a hand he knew. "She was here," he said. Mrs. Marr crossed her broad arm. "Many women have been here." She makes the capital R as if it is leaning away from the rest of the word. Perhaps the rest of the word deserved it. He almost smiled. The expression failed before it reached his eyes. "Did she tell you why she ran?" "She told me why she stayed. Men using your crest charge dead fishermen for tying boats they no longer own." Cassian looked at the split copper token near the receipts. "I gave Ambrose authority to collect the lawful harbor due. I did not give him this. Power rarely waits to be given everything it takes." He placed the northern returns beside Rosalind's copies. The numbers aligned like 2 halves of a confession. Ambrose had reported storms where boats had landed full catches. He had charged widows, diverted rents, and used a counterfeit estate stamp. "Where is she?" "Safe from you." "Mrs. Marr, the man who forged my seal, knows she found his theft. If I leave without warning her, I make the same error I made at the church." "And what error was that?" Cassian picked up the split token. "I thought authority made me worth obeying." Mrs. Marr studied him for a long moment. She did not reveal Rosalind's road. She did, however, tell him that the sea-wall needed stone before the autumn tides, and that Ambrose had sold the quarried blocks twice. Cassian remained in St. Aldwyn's for 9 days. He paid the lawful wages owed at the harbor from his own purse. He ordered stone delivered, dismissed the collector, and sent every receipt to a magistrate. He slept at the Blue Heron in a room with a leaking chimney, and asked each morning whether Mrs. Bell had returned. On the 10th day, Cobb found a black wax shaving beneath the old collector's desk, and a list of vessels written in cipher. Smuggling was hidden beneath the extortion. Ambrose had used Graymere warehouses to land French lace, brandy, and silk without duty. By then, someone had sent Ambrose word that the Duke was close. Cassian received a message before dawn. His sister had been injured in a carriage overturning near London. The letter bore the Graymere household mark and his sister's maid's name. He left within the hour. The message was false. Rosalind returned to St. Aldwyn's that afternoon and found new stones stacked beside the sea-wall. Mrs. Marr told her the Duke had stayed in the smallest upstairs room, eaten fish stew without complaint, and spent 9 days repairing damage bearing his own crest. "He asked where you were," Mrs. Marr said. Rosalind set down her valise. "What did you tell him?" "Scotland, thank you. I have not decided whether I did you a kindness." On the table, Cassian had left the forged wedding letter inside a plain oilskin cover. Beneath it was a second sheet in his own hand. The letter is false. "The words I spoke were mine. I have no defense for them. Ambrose copied an old impression of my seal. You owe me no return, but you are in danger while he remains free. Send one line to Jonas Cobb at Bow Street. Name any place, and protection will come without me. There was no plea, no command, no promise that an apology should alter what had happened." Rosalind read the message twice and folded it with the first. "Will you answer?" Mrs. Bristow asked. Rosalind looked toward the harbor. New stones shone pale beneath the wet sky. Men were already setting the blocks into the wall. Not yet. That night, someone cut the ropes securing 3 fishing boats. The tide carried one onto the rocks before the watchman raised the alarm. On the broken mast, a strip of black cloth had been tied in a bride's knot. The warning was meant for her. By sunrise, the black knot had answered Rosalind's delay. She carried her copied receipts to the sail loft, divided them into 3 packets, and gave each packet to a different person. One went beneath the false bottom of Mrs. Marr's flower chest. One went to the vicar, who disliked Lord Ambrose but feared scandal more than sin. The third she wrapped in sailcloth and entrusted to Nessa Cole's eldest brother, a quiet 16-year-old who carried fish inland twice a week. "Take this to York," Rosalind told him. "Place it in the hand of Jonas Cobb, care of the magistrates at Bow Street. If anyone asks, it is a sailmaker's invoice." The boy tucked it beneath his shirt. "Will it put Mr. Dace in jail?" Mr. Dace was Ambrose's dismissed collector. "It may put the man who commands him there." Nessa's brother left by the cliff path instead of the road. He returned 4 days later with a bruised mouth and no packet. 2 men had stopped him near Pickering, searched his cart, and warned him that the next message from Mrs. Bell would be buried with its messenger. Rosalind cleaned the cut above his lip while his mother gripped the back of a chair. A year earlier, Rosalind might have apologized until everyone in the room was required to comfort her. Now she tied the bandage, paid the boy his promised sovereign, and stood. "Mrs. Cole, no one will carry another paper for me. I shall carry the next one myself. They'll follow you." "Yes, away from your children." Mrs. Bristow opposed the plan until Rosalind showed her the sliced boat ropes, the tarred door, and the name of every person who had been threatened because of Mrs. Bell. "If I remain hidden here," Rosalind said, "Ambrose will punish St. Aldwyn's each time I refuse him. If I move, he must move. While he follows me, I can gather what Cobb needs from every captain who carried his goods. And the Duke?" Rosalind folded Cassian's apology into the inner pocket of her cloak. "The Duke has been searching for a woman who no longer exists. Let him discover what she was running toward." They left before dawn in a cooper's cart and traveled under Mrs. Bristow's name. Rosalind took only the wedding letters, 2 gowns, and a notebook sewn into the lining of her valise. The sail loft remained open under the management of Elspeth Marr and the 20 women whose hands had made it profitable. Before leaving, Rosalind executed a deed placing the lease in trust for their common benefit, with Elspeth and 2 other widows as trustees. An unmarried woman could contract in her own name. That small legal freedom, so ordinary on paper and so fragile in life, had once seemed merely temporary to Rosalind. Now she understood its weight. At the altar, one word would have placed her property, contracts, and legal existence beneath her husband's authority. By walking away before the vows, she had preserved more than her name. She had preserved the hand with which she could sign it. Cassian returned to St. Aldwyn's 11 days after the false message. His sister was healthy. His household mark had been copied, and Lord Ambrose's former valet had disappeared from London on the night the deception was sent. He found the sail loft busy and Rosalind gone. This time Mrs. Marr did not lie about Scotland. She gave him the piece of black cloth tied in a bride's knot and told him about the injured boy. Cassian's hand closed until the cloth vanished inside his fist. Why did she not send for Cobb? She did. Your cousin's men took the evidence. Where has she gone? She said you must discover what she was running toward. The answer would once have angered him. It now struck him as an instruction. He began at the sail loft. Each invoice named a ship. Each ship had a captain, and each captain had seen one part of Ambrose's coastal trade. Rosalind was traveling south, not hiding but collecting signatures. Cassian and Cobb followed the same line, always days behind. At Whitby, they found a captain who had signed a statement after Rosalind showed him that he had paid unlawful charges for 14 voyages. At Scarborough, a customs clerk admitted that a lady in a brown cloak had asked which manifests Lord Ambrose's agents altered. At Bridlington, an innkeeper produced a note she had left for Cassian. Repair the east cottages before winter. Their roofs have been charged twice and mended never. No greeting, no signature. He knew the hand. Cassian rode home, examined the roof accounts, and found Ambrose's fraud in the first hour. He dismissed the contractor, paid local men to complete the work, and sent copies of the false bills to Cobb. Then he returned to the coast. In November, he found another note at a rope walk near Hull. The widows of St. Aldwyn's have paid burial dues for men whose bodies were never recovered. Return the money. He returned it. In December, after frost sealed the ruts of the northern road, a ship chandler gave him a third. Do not punish Dace's children for their father's service to Ambrose. Cassian located the dismissed collector's family in a parish workhouse. He paid the arrears on their cottage and left before Dace's wife could kneel to him. Rosalind heard of each act because coastal news traveled with nets, salt, and weather. A fisherman carried word that the Duke had climbed onto a cottage roof when a ladder broke. A carter swore his grace had stood in sleet, counting returned burial shillings himself. Mrs. Bristow listened to these reports with open interest. Rosalind kept her eyes on her work. "A man can perform kindness while searching for applause," she said. "He has chosen very cold places to find it. He still wants something." "Yes," Mrs. Bristow replied. "The opportunity to tell you so without a locked door between you." Rosalind's pen paused. Outside their rented room in Hull, the bells marked 6 o'clock. The river smelled of tar, mud, and coal smoke. She had collected 5 sworn statements, 3 altered manifests, and the name of the engraver who had made Ambrose's counterfeit Graymere stamp. It was enough to prove fraud. It was not enough to prove that Ambrose had forged the wedding letter or ordered violence. The original letter remained in her cloak. She took it out after Mrs. Bristow slept. Cassian's apology rested folded around it. He had not written that he loved her. The restraint mattered more than any declaration might have done. He had acknowledged danger without claiming the right to protect her himself. He had obeyed her silence while continuing the work she asked of him. Rosalind pressed the papers flat. A floorboard creaked in the passage. The candle went out beneath her fingers. She heard the latch move. Mrs. Bristow woke as Rosalind crossed the room. They had learned to sleep with a chair wedged beneath the door handle. The chair scraped once, held, then jumped when a shoulder struck the wood from outside. "Window," Rosalind whispered. Their room stood one floor above a cooper's yard. Mrs. Bristow pushed up the sash while Rosalind gathered the valise. The door cracked near the lock. A man's hand reached through and swept blindly for the chair. Rosalind seized the ceramic wash jug and brought it down on his knuckles. He cursed. The hand vanished. They climbed onto the sloping roof in their nightclothes and cloaks. Frost glazed the tiles. Mrs. Bristow slid, caught the gutter, and stifled a cry. Rosalind gripped her wrist with both hands until the older woman found the ledge beneath the adjoining window. The bedroom door gave way behind them. Rosalind pushed the valise through the neighbor's open loft hatch, then followed Mrs. Bristow across. By the time Ambrose's men reached the roof, the women were descending through a warehouse full of hemp rope and sleeping apprentices. They lost the notebook. They kept the letters. The assault changed the search. Cobb obtained a magistrate's warrant against one of the men, but the attacker disappeared into the docks. Cassian sent guards to every witness Rosalind had named. He did not know where she slept, yet he placed protection around the trail she left behind. At Christmas, he returned alone to St. Bartholomew's. The abandoned veil remained in a cedar drawer in the vestry, exactly where the vicar had stored it after the failed wedding. Cassian had not permitted a servant to remove it. He stood before the altar and listened to sleet touch the windows. "You cannot conduct a courtship with an empty church," his sister Beatrix said from the rear pew. He had not heard her enter. "I am not courting her. No, you are haunting the roads of England. It is much less dignified." Cassian looked toward the door through which Rosalind had left. "She was right to go. That does not mean she will come back. I know." It was the first time he spoke the truth without trying to master it. January brought snow, hunger, and a letter from Rosalind's father. Mr. Merrivale had discovered irregularities in the trust created for his daughter's fortune. During the settlement negotiations, Lord Ambrose had persuaded him to place £80,000 temporarily in a bank connected to the Graymere debts. Half had since vanished through false loans. Mr. Merrivale blamed the Duke. He threatened proceedings in Chancery unless Cassian returned the entire sum. Cassian could have delayed for years. Equity cases moved slowly, and Ambrose's signatures obscured the theft. Instead, he sold a London house, a racing stable, and a collection of Dutch paintings inherited from his mother. He restored the missing money to Rosalind's trust before the end of February. "The loss was not yours," his solicitor said as Cassian signed the transfer. "My name opened the door through which it was taken. Miss Merrivale may never know. Then the act will remain useful without becoming persuasion." Mr. Merrivale knew. He sent Rosalind a copy of the transfer, with a letter demanding that she return home now that her fortune was safe. She read her father's demand beside Mrs. Bristow's sickbed in a cottage outside Grimsby. The older woman had developed an inflammation of the lungs after their escape across the frozen roof. A surgeon came twice a day, applying a blistering plaster that raised the skin near her shoulder and prescribing laudanum for the cough. Rosalind allowed the plaster because it eased the deeper pain, measured the drops herself, and refused the bleeding suggested by a second practitioner. For 12 nights she sat beside the bed, listening to each shallow breath. The Duke's transfer had restored enough money to make concealment unnecessary. Rosalind could take a fine house, hire servants, and force the trustees to account for every shilling. Yet the fortune felt less important than the line in Cassian's message she had memorized. The act will remain useful without becoming persuasion. Her father had quoted it with disgust. Mrs. Bristow's fever broke at dawn on the 13th day. She opened her eyes and found Rosalind holding her hand. "Did he find us?" she whispered. "No, persistent man. Very poor hunter." Rosalind laughed for the first time since the wedding. The sound frightened her with its ease. In March she stopped running. She wrote to Jonas Cobb and named a coaching inn in York. Cassian was not to attend. Cobb arrived with a local magistrate's clerk, 2 constables, and a packet of evidence collected by the Duke. Rosalind placed the forged wedding letter beside the false harbor stamps. The engraver had sworn that Ambrose ordered both. What they still lacked was a witness tying Ambrose to the smuggling warehouses and the attacks. "Dace will speak," Rosalind said. Cobb shook his head. "He fled St. Aldwyn's. His wife knows where he is. I asked the Duke not to punish his children. His Grace found them. A man may stay loyal to fear until mercy gives him somewhere else to stand." Dace surrendered 3 days later. In exchange for consideration at sentencing and protection for his family, he described the hidden cellar beneath the St. Aldwyn's signal tower, the night landings, the cut boat ropes, and Ambrose's plan to destroy the harbor records during the highest spring tide in April. The magistrate set the inspection for the 14th. Rosalind looked at the date. It was the anniversary of the wedding she had refused. Ambrose learned of the inspection before the warrant was sealed. Someone in the York office accepted his money and carried the news east. He reached St. Aldwyn's first. On the morning of April 14th, Rosalind returned to the village beneath a sky the color of pewter. 1 year earlier she had worn ivory, satin, and pearls. Now she wore a dark blue wool dress, stout boots, and the brown cloak mended at both elbows. Mrs. Bristow remained in York to recover. Cobb traveled with the magistrate by the main road, while Rosalind took the faster cliff path with Dace. The sea below had withdrawn farther than Rosalind had ever seen it, exposing black rocks veined with weed. By dusk the spring tide would return against an east wind. The repaired wall could hold ordinary water. It could not hold the sea if the old tide gate beneath the signal tower remained open. Dace stopped at the edge of the village. The color left his face. Black smoke rose from the sail loft. Rosalind ran. Villagers formed a line from the pump, passing leather buckets hand to hand. Fire licked from an upper window. Elspeth Marr stood in the street with blood on her forehead, shouting that 2 women were still inside. Rosalind wrapped a wet grain sack around her shoulders and entered through the rear. Smoke lowered the ceiling to arm's height. She crawled beneath it, found Nessa and her mother beside a fallen beam, and guided them toward the door by following the cold draft across the floor. Outside, strong hands lifted the beam from her path. Cassian emerged through the smoke. For 1 suspended second, neither moved. His face was leaner than it had been at the church. A pale scar crossed his brow. His coat bore no silver, only mud and ash. He looked at Rosalind as if the entire year had narrowed to the space between them. "Are you hurt?" he asked. "No, Mrs. Cole needs air." He took the injured woman without another word. The villagers smothered the last flames before they reached the stored canvas. The copied receipts hidden beneath a floorboard had vanished. In their place, Ambrose had left the Duke's old black seal and a message scratched into the table: "Bride, Tower, before the tide." Cassian read it over Rosalind's shoulder. "You will remain here." She turned toward him. He closed his eyes for the length of one breath. "Forgive me, that was the habit speaking. What do you intend?" "The tide gate is controlled from the tower cellar. If Ambrose opens it at flood, the lower street will fill before the magistrate arrives. Then we go together. You have spent a year searching for me, your grace. If you came to take me home, say it now." The villagers moved around them, carrying smoking canvas and broken boards. Cassian did not look away. "I came because Cobb sent word that you would testify," he said. "I came to place every resource I possess behind your evidence. I searched for a year because the last thing I gave you was a command, and I could not bear for it to be the final truth you knew of me. But I have no home to offer unless you choose it." Rosalind's throat tightened. She fastened her cloak at the neck so her hands had something to do. "Good," she said. "Then help me save mine." They climbed the cliff road as the first edge of the tide turned silver below. Dace led them to a narrow path behind the signal tower. Cobb and the magistrate were still delayed on the flooded inland road. 6 fishermen followed, but a shot from the upper window struck the earth near their feet. Cassian ordered them behind the stone wall. "There may be 3 men inside," Dace said. "Ambrose keeps pistols in the cellar." Rosalind studied the tower. A weathered bell hung beneath its roof, once used to warn ships when fog covered the headland. A rope descended inside. At the base, a culvert carried seawater beneath the road and into the old salt basin. The brass tide key that locked the gate was missing from its bracket. "There is another entrance from the shore," Dace said, "at low water only." The sea had begun to cover the rocks. "How long?" Cassian asked. 20 minutes before the passage fills." Rosalind was already descending the cliff steps. The shore entrance was a black slit between boulders. They entered bent double. Salt water dripped from the roof, and the air smelled of kelp, stone, and hidden brandy. Crates lined the tunnel, each marked as lamp oil, and packed with French lace beneath straw. At the far end, candlelight showed through an iron grate. Dace produced a narrow key. His hand shook so violently that metal scraped metal. "My lord will kill my family." "Your family is guarded," Cassian said. "Open it." The gate swung inward, a pistol cocked in the darkness. Ambrose stood at the foot of the cellar stairs, holding Elspeth Mar's 12-year-old grandson by the collar. The brass tide key glinted in his other hand. 2 armed men waited behind him. "A year," Ambrose said, smiling at Cassian. "I wondered which of you would teach the other to follow." He pressed the pistol beneath the boy's jaw. "Rosalind comes upstairs. The rest remain here." Cassian moved half a step. Ambrose tightened his grip. "You may inherit many things, cousin. The ability to stop a bullet is not among them." Rosalind looked at the water curling around her boots. The tunnel floor was already flooding. If Ambrose kept the tide gate open, the pressure would drive the sea through the basin and into St. Aldwyn's. If he closed the tunnel grate behind her, Cassian and Dace would drown before the passage emptied. "I will go," she said, Rosalind. She met Cassian's eyes. "Trust me." He stepped back. Ambrose took her cloak, searched the pockets, and found both wedding letters. Satisfaction softened his mouth. "There it is. 1 foolish page that cost me a year. Your vanity cost you a year. The page cost you a dukedom you never possessed." He struck her across the face with the back of his hand. Cassian surged forward. The pistol lifted toward the child. "Stay," Rosalind said. Cassian stopped. Ambrose forced Rosalind up the stair. The round tower room smelled of oil and damp rope. Wind pushed through the arrow slits. On a table waited a written confession, stating that Rosalind had forged the Duke's seal, stolen money from her trust, and directed Dace to invent charges against Lord Ambrose after Graymere rejected her. "Sign it," Ambrose said. "And then you leave for France. The Duke returns to his creditors. St. Aldwyn's learns the danger of counting another man's money. Below them, the first surge struck the culvert with a deep iron boom. Rosalind looked at the tide mechanism. A chain ran from the brass key housing through a geared wheel and down into the stone. Ambrose had wedged the wheel open with a steel pin. The alarm bell rope hung within 3 paces of the table. "You cannot control what happens after the village floods," she said. "I need only control what is believed. Cassian's name is on every charge. Your name will be on the confession." He set the brass key beside the paper and pushed a pen toward her. "You will obey me now." Rosalind looked down at the waiting signature line. The church returned with painful clarity. Wet stone, crushed rosemary, the weight of lace against her hair, and a man saying that obedience was all he required. She had walked into ruin rather than answer him with a vow. She lifted the pen. Ambrose relaxed. Rosalind drove the steel nib through the paper and into the back of his hand. He shouted and dropped the pistol. She snatched the brass key, kicked the weapon beneath the stair rail, and threw herself toward the bell rope. Ambrose caught the back of her dress. Fabric tore across her shoulder. She reached the rope with both hands and let her weight fall. The bell struck once above St. Aldwyn's. Its sound rolled over the cliff like thunder. Rosalind pulled again. Ambrose dragged her backward. But the second peal brought shouts from the road below. The magistrate had arrived. One of Ambrose's men ran up the cellar steps. Cassian struck him at the doorway and seized the fallen pistol. Dace threw open the outer grate so the rising water could spill back toward the sea. Elspeth's grandson crawled free. Ambrose wrapped the bell rope around Rosalind's throat and pulled. Cassian raised the pistol but could not fire without risking her. "Release her! Throw it down!" Rosalind clawed one hand beneath the rope. With the other, she pushed the brass key into the tide wheel housing. It turned halfway and jammed against the steel pin. Water burst through the floor, grating. "The pin!" she gasped. Cassian understood. He lowered the pistol, lunged beneath Ambrose's reach, and seized the wheel. Ambrose kicked him against the stone. Rosalind twisted, brought her heel down on Ambrose's instep, and tore free of the rope. Together, she and Cassian pulled the steel pin. The gear spun hard enough to strip skin from Cassian's palm. Rosalind forced the brass key through the final quarter turn. Deep beneath them, the tide gate crashed shut. The tower shook. Water struck stone, divided by the closed gate, and rushed back through the sea tunnel instead of toward the village. Ambrose seized the pistol from the floor. Dace stepped between him and Rosalind. "Tell them," Dace said. "Tell His Grace why you ordered the letter." "Because he was going to marry her," Ambrose shouted. "A child would have ended everything. The title, the estate, every debt I meant him to carry until he broke. She was supposed to flee and be forgotten." Footsteps filled the lower stair. Jonas Cobb entered first, followed by two constables and the magistrate. Ambrose looked at the open door, the witnesses, and the confession pierced beneath Rosalind's pen. His grip slackened. Cobb took the pistol from him. Rosalind picked up the forged wedding letter where it had fallen. Black wax had cracked across the false griffin, dividing its perfect wing. "1 year ago," she said, "you believed a woman walking away had made herself powerless. Ambrose's face had gone white. You were wrong." The constables led him down the tower stairs while the warning bell continued to sway above them, sounding one final, fading note over the sea. Lord Ambrose Vane was committed for forgery, fraud, smuggling, assault, and conspiracy to destroy property and life. Mr. Dace gave evidence before the assizes. His cooperation did not erase his crimes, but it spared his family and reduced his sentence. The men who had attacked the messenger and the Hull lodging were found through the names in the shipping cipher. Cassian repaid every unlawful harbor charge from the Graymere estate, including dues demanded from the dead. He placed the northern holdings under a local board made up of fishermen, tradesmen, and 2 of the sail loft women. No collector could alter a charge without their marks beside it. Rosalind used part of her restored fortune to rebuild the loft in stone. The new deed placed it in trust for the women of St. Aldwyn's, securing their income beyond any husband's creditor. When her father complained that the investment produced too little dignity, She told him dignity had never once appeared in his accounts because he did not know how to value it. Cassian did not ask her to marry him at the Tower. He did not ask the following week, when he brought a physician for Mrs. Bristow, or in May, when he stood beside Rosalind while the first repaired fishing boat entered the harbor. He returned to Graymere and wrote to her. His letters described roofs, rents, harvest forecasts, and the names of tenants he had once known only as figures. Rosalind answered when she wished. Sometimes she corrected his sums. Sometimes she left 3 weeks between replies. He never demanded more. In September, she visited the South Cottages and found every roof repaired. In October, Cassian came to St. Aldwyn's without servants and spent 2 days carrying bolts of sailcloth after a wagon axle broke. By winter, the villagers no longer lowered their voices when they saw him beside her. On the first mild morning of the next spring, Cassian asked Rosalind to walk with him to St. Bartholomew's. The church was empty except for Mrs. Bristow and Beatrix, who waited near the rear pew. There were no guests, no musicians, and no special license hidden in a vestry drawer. The old veil rested on the prayer desk. It had been cleaned, but not repaired. The tear made by the pin remained visible near the edge. Cassian did not touch it. "I brought you here because this is where I last asked for the wrong thing," he said. "I required obedience before I had offered trust. I mistook your silence for agreement and my rank for character." Rosalind looked at the aisle she had walked alone. "What do you require now?" she asked. "Nothing you do not give freely." He held out no ring. There was no audience to reward either answer. "And what do you offer?" "The truth when it diminishes me. Partnership when it inconveniences me. A home with doors you may open, close, or leave through, and every day I am given to become worth the answer I hope for." Rosalind let the silence remain until he understood that she was not afraid of it. Then she took the torn veil from the desk, folded it once, and placed it back in the cedar drawer. "No veil," she said. "And when I speak of obedience, you will remember it is a promise entrusted, not a chain granted." Cassian's breath left him in something between a laugh and a prayer. "As you wish." They married 6 weeks later in St. Aldwyn's Parish Church, after the banns had been called on 3 Sundays. Elspeth Marr sat in the front pew. Nessa Cole carried Rosemary from the cliff path. 20 sailmakers filled one side of the nave, and the Graymere tenants filled the other. When the clergyman asked who gave Rosalind, no man answered for her. She stepped forward on her own. When the old word obey came, her voice remained clear. Cassian bowed his head as though hearing not a surrender, but a trust he would spend his life honoring. Years later, people still told the story of the bride, who had left a duke before the vows, and made him search a year for the truth. They usually told it badly. They said Cassian's devotion had brought her back, or that love had conquered pride in a single noble moment. Rosalind knew better. She had not returned because he found her. She returned because, mile by mile and choice by choice, he had learned how not to possess what he loved. On storm evenings, the bell above the St. Aldwyn's Tower sounded across the dark water. In the workroom below, women stitched strong white canvas beneath clear glass lamps, and the closed-tied gate held, "Thank you for staying with Rosalind's complete story, a story about dignity, hard-earned trust, and the courage to refuse a vow that would erase you." If her journey moved you, please give this video a like. It helps the algorithm carry more historical romance dramas to viewers who love them. Share this story with someone who enjoys dukes, hidden betrayals, and heroines who claim their own future. Subscribe to Secrets of Belgrave and turn on notifications so you do not miss the next full story. And tell me in the comments, could you have trusted the Duke again after he spent a year proving he had changed?